In the world of cryptography, storing data in plain text is the biggest risk an organization can take. From a consumer point of view, we prefer our data to be encrypted at all points, be it during transit or at rest. Hashing has provided to be quite beneficial in this regard since the early 90s and still finds use when storing critical data. Today, we will cover the technical aspects of hashing while going through some well-known hash functions and algorithms at the end. Let's take a look at the topics we are covering today. We start by learning about cryptography in general and its various applications, historical significance, and categories. We also have a demonstration of how cryptography is used in today's industry when encrypting internet traffic. We follow that up by taking a deep dive onto hashing. We cover the basics of hashing like hash functions, guidelines, ways to strengthen hashes, among other things. Next, we cover the MD5 hash algorithm, explaining the steps taken when scrambling the data and checking out its applications and advantages. Finally, we also cover the SHA hash algorithm, its phases during hashing, and the distinct advantages over other algorithms of this nature. With the rise in censorship and general fear over privacy laws, consumer security is at an all-time high risk. Technology has made our lives so much easier while putting up a decent target on our personal information. It is necessary to understand how to simultaneously safeguard our data and be up to date with the latest technological developments. Maintaining this balance has become easier with cryptography taking its place in today's digital world. So here's a story to help you understand cryptography. Meet Anne. Anne wanted to look for a decent discount on the latest iPhone. She started searching on the internet and found a rather shady website that offered a 50% discount on the first purchase. Once Anne submitted her payment details, a huge chunk of money was withdrawn from her bank account just moments after. Devastated, Anne quickly realized she had failed to notice that the website was a HTTP web page instead of an HTTPS one. The payment information submitted was not encrypted and it was visible to anyone keeping an eye, including the website owner and hackers. Had she used a reputed website which has encrypted transactions and employs cryptography, our iPhone enthusiast could have avoided this particular incident. This is why it's never recommended to visit unknown websites or share any personal information on them. Now that we understand why cryptography is so important, let's now understand what cryptography is. Cryptography is the science of encrypting or decrypting information to prevent unauthorized access. We transform our data and personal information so that only the correct recipient can understand the message. As an essential aspect of modern data security, using cryptography allows the secure storage and transmission of data between willing parties. Encryption is the primary route for employing cryptography by adding certain algorithms to jumble up the data. Decryption is the process of reversing the work done by encrypting information so that the data becomes readable again. Both of these methods form the basis of cryptography. For example, when Simplilearn is jumbled up or changed in any format, not many people can guess the original word by looking at the encrypted text. The only ones who can are the people who know how to decrypt the coded word, thereby reversing the process of encryption. Any data pre-encryption is called plain text or clear text. To encrypt the message, we use certain algorithms that serve a single purpose of scrambling the data to make them unreadable without the necessary tools. These algorithms are called ciphers. They are a set of detailed steps to be carried out one after the other to make sure the data becomes as unreadable as possible until it reaches the receiver. We take the plain text, pass it to the cipher algorithm, and get the encrypted data. This encrypted text is called the ciphertext, and this is the message that is transferred between the two parties. The key that is being used to scramble the data is known as the encryption key. These steps, that is the cipher and the encryption key, are made known to the receiver, who can then reverse the encryption on receiving the message. Unless any third party manages to find out both the algorithm and the secret key that is being used, they cannot decrypt the messages since both of them are necessary to unlock the hidden content. Wonder what else we would lose if not for cryptography? Any website where you have an account can read your passwords. Important emails can be intercepted and their contents can be read without encryption during their transit. More than 65 billion messages are sent on WhatsApp every day, all of which are secured thanks to end-to-end encryption. There is a huge market opening up for cryptocurrency, which is possible due to blockchain technology that uses encryption algorithms and hashing functions to ensure that the data is secure. If this is of particular interest to you, you can watch our video on blockchain, the link of which will be in the description. Of course, there is no single solution to a problem as diverse as explained. There are three variants of how cryptography works and is in practice. They are symmetric encryption, asymmetric encryption, and hashing. Let's find out how much we have understood until now. Do you remember the difference between a cipher and ciphertext? Leave your answers in the comments, and before we proceed, if you find this video interesting, make sure to give it a thumbs up before moving ahead. Let's look at symmetric encryption first. Symmetric encryption uses a single key for both the encryption and decryption of data. It is comparatively less secure than asymmetric encryption, but much faster. It is a compromise that has to be embraced in order to deliver data as fast as possible without leaving information completely vulnerable. This type of encryption is used when data rests on servers and identifies personnel for payment applications and services. The potential drawback with symmetric encryption is that both the sender and receiver need to have the same secret key, and it should be kept hidden at all times. Caesar cipher and Enigma machine are both symmetric encryption examples that we will look into further. For example, if Alice wants to send a message to Bob, she can apply a substitution cipher or a shift cipher to encrypt the message. But Bob must be aware of the same key itself, so he can decrypt it when he finds it necessary to read the entire message. Symmetric encryption uses one of the two types of ciphers, stream ciphers and block ciphers. Block ciphers break the plain text into blocks of fixed size and use the key to convert it into ciphertext. Stream ciphers convert the plain text into ciphertext one bit at a time instead of resorting to breaking them up into bigger chunks. In today's world, the most widely used symmetric encryption algorithm is AES 256, that stands for Advanced Encryption Standard, which has a key size of 256-bit with 128-bit and 196-bit key sizes also being available. Other primitive algorithms like the Data Encryption Standard, that is the DES, the Triple Data Encryption Standard 3DES, and Blowfish have all fallen out of favor due to the rise of AES. AES chops up the data into blocks and performs 10 plus rounds of obscuring and substituting the message to make it unreadable. Asymmetric encryption, on the other hand, has a double whammy at its disposal. There are two different keys at play here, a public key and a private key. The public key is used to encrypt information pre-transit, and a private key is used to decrypt the information post-transit. If Alice wants to communicate with Bob using asymmetric encryption, she encrypts the message using Bob's public key. After receiving the message, Bob uses his own private key to decrypt the data. This way, nobody can intercept the message in between transmissions, and there is no need for any secure key exchange for this to work, since the encryption is done with the public key and the decryption is done with the private key that no one except Bob has access to. Both the keys are necessary to read the full message. There is also a reverse scenario where we can use the private key for encryption and the public key for decryption. A server can sign non-confidential information using its private key, and anyone who has its public key can decrypt the message. This mechanism also proves that the sender is authenticated and there is no problem with the origin of the information. RSA encryption is the most widely used asymmetric encryption standard. It is named after its founders Rivest, Shamir, and Edelman, and it uses block ciphers that separate the data into blocks and obscure the information. Widely considered the most secure form of encryption, albeit relatively slower than AES, it is widely used in web browsing, secure identification, VPNs, emails, and chat applications. With so much hanging on the key's secrecy, there must be a way to transmit the keys without others reading our private data. Many systems use a combination of symmetric encryption and asymmetric encryption to bolster security and match speed at the same time. Since asymmetric encryption takes longer to decrypt large amounts of data, the full information is encrypted using a single key, that is, symmetric encryption. That single key is then transmitted to the receiver using asymmetric encryption, so you don't have to compromise either way. Another route is using the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which relies on a one-way function and is much tougher to break into. The third variant of cryptography is termed as hashing. Hashing is the process of scrambling a piece of data beyond recognition. It gives an output of fixed size, which is known as the hash value of the original data, or just hash in general. The calculations that do the job of messing up the data collection form the hash function. They are generally not reversible without resilient brute force mechanisms and are very helpful when storing data on website servers that need not be stored in plain text. For example, many websites store your account passwords in a hashed format so that not even the administrator can read your credentials. When a user tries to log in, they can compare the entered password's hash value with the hash value that is already stored on the servers for authentication, since the function will always return the same value for the same input. Cryptography has been in practice for centuries. Julius Caesar used a substitution shift to move alphabets a certain number of spaces beyond their place in the alphabet table. A spy can't decipher the original message at first glance. For example, if he wanted to pass confidential information to his armies and decides to use the substitution shift of +2, A becomes C, B becomes D, and so on. The word attack, when passed through a substitution shift of +3, becomes DWWDEFN. This cipher has been appropriately named the Caesar cipher, which is one of the most widely used algorithms. The Enigma is probably the most famous cryptographic cipher device used in ancient history. It was used by the Nazi German armies in the World Wars. They were used to protect confidential political, military, and administrative information, and it consisted of 3 or more rotors that scrambled the original message depending on the machine's state at that time. The decryption is similar, but it needs both machines to stay in the same state before passing the ciphertext so that we receive the same plain text message. Let's take a look at how our data is protected while we browse the internet thanks to cryptography. Here we have a web-based tool that will help us understand the process of RSA encryption. We see the entire workflow from selecting the key size to be used until the decryption of the ciphertext in order to get the plain text back. As we already know, RSA encryption algorithm falls under the umbrella of asymmetric key cryptography. That basically implies that we have two keys at play here, a public key and a private key. Typically, the public key is used by the sender to encrypt the message, and the private key is used by the receiver to decrypt the message. There are some occasions when this allocation is reversed, and we will have a look at them as well. In RSA, we have the choice of key size. We can select any key from a 512-bit to 1024-bit all the way up to a 4096-bit key. The longer the key length, the more complex the encryption process becomes, and thereby strengthening the ciphertext. Although with added security, more complex functions take longer to perform the same operations on similar size of data. We have to keep a balance between both speed and strength, because the strongest encryption algorithms are of no use if they cannot be practically deployed on systems around the world. Let's take a 1024-bit key over here. Now we need to generate the keys. This generation is done by functions that operate on passphrases. The tool we are using right now generates these pseudo-random keys to be used in this explanation. Once we generate the keys, you can see the public key is rather smaller than the private key, which is almost always the case. These two keys are mathematically linked with each other. They cannot be substituted with any other key, and in order to encrypt the original message or decrypt the ciphertext, this pair must be kept together. The public key is then sent to the sender, and the receiver keeps the private key with himself. In this scenario, let's try and encrypt a word, Simplilearn. We have to select if the key being used for encryption is either private or public, since that affects the process of scrambling the information. Since we are using the public key over here, let's select the same and copy it and paste over here. The cipher we are using right now is plain RSA. There are some modified ciphers with their own pros and cons that can also be used, provided we use it on a regular basis and depending on the use case as well. Once we click on encrypt, we can see the ciphertext being generated over here. The pseudorandom generating functions are created in such a way that a single character change in the plaintext will trigger a completely different ciphertext. This is a security feature to strengthen the process from brute force methods. Now that we are done with the encryption process, let's take a look at the decryption part. The receiver gets this ciphertext from the sender with no other key or supplement. He or she must already possess the private key generated from the same pair. No other private key can be used to decrypt the message since they are mathematically linked. We paste the private key here and select the same. The cipher must also be the same used during the encryption process. Once we click decrypt, you can see the original plaintext we had decided to encrypt. This sums up the entire process of RSA encryption and decryption. Now some people use it the other way around. We also have the option of using the private key to encrypt information and the public key to decrypt it. This is done mostly to validate the origin of the message. Since the keys only work in pairs, if a different private key is used to encrypt the message, the public key cannot decrypt it. Conversely, if the public key is able to decrypt the message, it must have been encrypted with the right private key and hence the rightful owner. Here we just have to take the private key and use that to encrypt the plaintext and select the same in this checkbox as well. You can see we have generated a completely new ciphertext. This ciphertext will be sent to the receiver, and this time we will use the public key for decryption. Let's select the correct checkbox and decrypt, and we still get the same output. Now let's take a look at practical example of encryption in the real world. We all use the internet on a daily basis, and many are aware of the implications of using unsafe websites. Let's take a look at Wikipedia here. Pretty standard HTTPS website where the H stands for secured. Let's take a look at how it secures the data. Wireshark is the world's foremost and most widely used network protocol analyzer. It lets you see what's happening on your network at a microscopic level, and we are going to use this software to see the traffic that is leaving our machine and to understand how vulnerable it is. Since there are many applications running in this machine, let's apply a filter that will only show us the results related to Wikipedia. Let's search for something that we can navigate the website with. Okay, once we get into it a little, you can see some of the requests being populated over here. Let's take a look at the specific request. These are the data packets that basically transport the data from our machine to the internet and vice versa. As you can see, there's a bunch of gibberish data here that doesn't really reveal anything that we searched or watched. Similarly, other secured websites function the same way, and it is very difficult, if at all possible, to snoop on user data this way. To put this in perspective, let's take a look at another website, which is a HTTP web page. This has no encryption enabled from the server end, which makes it vulnerable to attacks. There is a login form here, which needs legitimate user credentials in order to grant access. Let's enter a random pair of credentials. These obviously won't work, but we can see the manner of data transfer. Unsurprisingly, we weren't able to get into the platform. Instead, we can see the data packets. Let's apply a similar filter that will help us understand what request this website is sending. These are the requests being sent by the HTTP login form to the internet. If we check here, see, Whatever username and password that we are entering, we can easily see it with the Wireshark. Now, we used a dummy pair of credentials. If we select the right data packet, we can find our correct credentials. If any website had asked for our payment information or our legitimate credentials, it would have been really easy to get a hold of these. To reiterate what we have already learned, we must always avoid HTTP websites and just unknown or not trustworthy websites in general, because the problem we saw here is just the tip of the iceberg. Even though cryptography has managed to lessen the risk of cyber attacks, it is still prevalent and we should always be alert to keep ourselves safe online.
Imagine creating an account on a new website. You provide your email address and set a password that you are confident and you would not forget. What about the website owner? How securely are they going to store your password? For website administrators, they have three alternatives. They can either store the passwords in a plain text format, they can encrypt the passwords using an encryption and decryption key, or they can store the passwords in a hash value. Let's have a look at each of these. When a password is stored in plain text format, it is considered to be the most unsafe option since anyone in the company can read your passwords. A single hack and a data server breach will expose all the account's credentials without needing any extra effort. To counter this, owners can encrypt the passwords and keep them in the servers as a second alternative. But that would mean they also have to store the decryption key somewhere on their servers. In the event of a data breach or the server hack, both the decryption key and encrypted passwords will be leaked, thus making it a single point of failure. What if there was an option to store the passwords after scrambling them completely, but with no way to decrypt them? This is where hashing comes to play. Since only the hashed values are stored in the server, no encryption is needed. With no plain text passwords to protect, your credentials are safe from the website administrators. Considering all the pros, hashed passwords are the industry standard when it comes to storing credentials nowadays. Before getting too deep into the topic, let's get a brief overview of how hashing works. Hashing is the process of scrambling a piece of information or data beyond recognition. We can achieve this by using hash functions, which are essentially algorithms that perform mathematical operations on the main plain text. The value generated after passing the plain text information through the hash function is called the hash value, digest, or in general, just the hash of the original data. While this may sound similar to encryption, the major difference is hashes are meant to be irreversible. No decryption key can convert a digest back to its original value. However, a few hashing algorithms have been broken due to the increase in computational complexity of today's new generation computers and processors. There are new algorithms that stand the test of time and are still in use among multiple areas for password storage, identity verification, etc. Like we discussed earlier, websites use hashing to store the user's passwords. So how do they make use of these hash passwords? When a user signs up to create a new account, the password is then run through the hash function and the resulting hash value is stored on the servers. So the next time a user comes to log into the account, the password he enters is passed through the same hash function and compared to the hash stored on the main server. If the newly calculated hash is the same as the one stored on the website server, the password must have been correct because according to hash functions terminology, same inputs will always provide the same outputs. If the hashes do not match, then the password entered during login is not the same as the password entered during the sign-up. Hence, the login will be denied. This way, no plain text passwords get stored, preventing both the owner from snooping on user data and protecting users' privacy in the unfortunate event of a data breach or a hack. Apart from password storage, hashing can also be used to perform integrity checks. When a file is uploaded on the internet, the file's hash value is generated and it is uploaded along with the original information. When a new user downloads the file, he can calculate the digest of the downloaded file using the same hash function. When the hash values are compared, if they match, then file integrity has been maintained and there has been no data corruption. Since so much important information is being passed onto the hash function, we need to understand how they work. A hash function is a set of mathematical calculations operated on two blocks of data. the main input is broken down into two blocks of similar size. The block size is dependent on the algorithm that is being used. Hash functions are designed to be one-way. They shouldn't be reversible, at least by design. Some algorithms, like the previously mentioned MD5, have been compromised, but more secure algorithms are being used today, like the SHA family of algorithms. The digest size is also dependent on the respective algorithm being used. MD5 has a digest of 128 bits, while SHA256 has a digest of 256 bits. This digest must always be the same for the same input, irrespective of how many times the calculations are carried out. This is a very crucial feature since comparing the hash value is the only way to check if the data is untouched, as the functions are not reversible. There are certain requirements of a hash function that need to be met before they are accepted. While some of them are easy to guess, others are placed in order to preserve security in the long run. The hash function must be quick enough to encrypt large amounts of data at a relatively fast pace, but it also shouldn't be very fast. Running the algorithm on all cylinders makes the functions easy to brute force and a security liability. There must be a balance to allow the hash function to handle large amounts of data and not make it ridiculously easy to brute force by running through all the possible combinations. The hash function must be dependent on each bit of the input. The input can be text, audio, video, or any other file extension. If a single character is being changed, it doesn't matter how small that character may be, the entire digest must have a distinctly different hash value. This is essential to create unique digests for every password that is being stored. But what if two different users are using the same password? Since the hash function is the same for all users, both the digests will be the same. This is called a hash collision. You may think this must be a rare occasion where two users have exactly the same password, but that is not the case. We have techniques like salting that can be used to reduce these hash collisions, as we will discuss later in this video. You would be shocked to see the most used passwords of 2020. All of these passwords are laughably insecure, and since many people use the same passwords repeatedly on different websites, hash collisions risks are more common than one would expect. Let's say the hash functions find two users having the same password. How can they store both the hashes without messing up the original data? This is where salting and peppering come to play. Salting is the process of adding a random keyword to the end of the input before it is passed on to the hash function. This random keyword is unique for each user on the system, and it is called the salt value or just the salt. So even if two passwords are exactly the same, the salt value will differ, and so will their digest. There is a small problem with this process though. Since the salt is unique for each user, they need to be stored in the database along with the passwords, and sometimes even in plain text to speed up the process of continuous verification. If the server is hacked, then the hashes will need to be brute forced, which takes a lot of time. But if they receive the salts as well, the entire process becomes very fast. This is something that peppering aims to solve. Peppering is the process of adding a random string of data to the input before passing them to the hash function. But this time the random string is not unique for each user. It is supposed to be common for all users in the database, and the extra bit added is called the pepper in this case. The pepper isn't stored on the servers. It is mostly hard-coded onto the website source code, since it's going to be the same for all credentials. This way, even if the servers get hacked, they will not have the right pepper needed to crack into all the passwords. Many websites use a combination of salting and peppering to solve the problem of hash collision and bolster security. Since brute force takes such a long time, many hackers avoid taking the effort. The returns are mostly not worth it, and the possible combinations of using both salting and peppering is humongous.
With the consensus aiming towards an educated public on digital privacy, it's no surprise to see an increasing interest in encryption algorithms. We have already covered the major names like the DES and the AES algorithm. MD5 algorithm was one of the first hashing algorithms to take the global stage as a successor to the MD4. Despite the security vulnerabilities encountered in the future, MD5 still remains a crucial part of data infrastructure in a multitude of environments. The MD5 hashing algorithm is a one-way cryptographic function that accepts a message of any length as input, and it returns as output a fixed length digest value to be used for authenticating the original messages. The digest size is always 128 bits irrespective of the input. The MD5 hash function was originally designed for use as a secure cryptographic hash algorithm to authenticate digital signatures. MD5 has also been deprecated for uses other than as a non-cryptographic checksum to verify data integrity and detect unintentional data corruption. Ronald Rivest, founder of RSA Data Security and Institute professor at MIT, designed MD5 as an improvement to a prior message digest algorithm, which was the MD4. As already iterated before, the process is straightforward. We pass a plaintext message to the MD5 hash functions, which in turn perform certain mathematical operations on the clear text to scramble the data. The 128-bit digest received from this is going to be radically different from the plaintext. The goal of any message digest function is to produce digests that appear to be random. To be considered cryptographically secure, the hash function should meet two requirements. First, that it is impossible for an attacker to generate a message that matches a specific hash value, and second, that it is impossible for an attacker to create two messages that produce the same hash value. Even a slight change in the plaintext should trigger a drastic difference in the two digests. This goes a long way in preventing hash collisions, which take place when two different plaintexts have the same digest. To achieve this level of intricacy, there are a number of steps to be followed before we receive the digest. Let us take a look at the detailed procedure as to how the MD5 hash algorithm works. The first step is to make the plaintext compatible with the hash function. To do this, we need to pad the bits in the message. When we receive the input string, we have to make sure the size is 64 bits short of a multiple of 512. When it comes to padding the bits, we must add 1 first, followed by zeros to round out the extra characters. This prepares a string to have a length of just 64 bits less than any multiple of 512. Here on out, we can proceed on to the next step where we have to pad the length bits. Initially in the first step, we appended the message in such a way that the total length of the bits in the message was 64 bits short of any multiple of 512. Now we add the length bits in such a way that the total number of bits in the message is perfectly a multiple of 512. That means 64-bit lengths to be precise are added to the message. Our final string to be hashed is now a definite multiple of 512. The next step would be to initialize the message digest buffer. The entire hashing plaintext is now broken down into 512-bit blocks. There are 4 buffers or registers that are of 32 bits each, named A, B, C, and D. These are the 4 words that are going to store the values of each of these subblocks. The first iteration to follow these registers will have fixed hexadecimal values as shown on the screen below. Once these values are initialized, of these 512 blocks, we can divide each of them into 16 further subblocks of 32 bits each. For each of these subblocks, we run 4 rounds of operations having the 4 buffer variables A, B, C, and D. These rounds require the other constant variables as well, which differ with each round of operation. The constant values are stored in a random array of 64 elements. Since each 32-bit subblock is run 4 times, 16 such subblocks equal 64 constant values needed for a single block iteration. The subblocks can be denoted by the alphabet M, and the constant values are denoted by the alphabet T. Coming to the actual round of operation, we see our 4 buffers which already have pre-initialized values for the first iteration. At the very beginning, the values of buffers B, C, and D are passed on to a non-linear logarithmic function. The formula behind this function changes by the particular round being worked on, as we shall see later in this video. Once the output is calculated, it is added to the raw value stored in buffer A. The output of this addition is added to the particular 32-bit subblock using which we are running the 4 operations. The output of this requisite function then needs to be added to a constant value derived from the constant array k. Since we have 64 different elements in the array, Since we have 64 different elements in the array, we can use a distinct element for each iteration of a particular block. The next step involves a circular shift that increases the complexity of the hash algorithm and is necessary to create a unique digest for each individual input. The output generated is later added to the value stored in the buffer B. The final output is now stored in the second buffer of B of the output register. Individual values of C, D, and A are derived from the preceding element before the iteration started, meaning the value of B gets stored in C, value of C gets stored in D, and the value of D in A. Now that we have a full register ready for this subblock, the values of A, B, C, D are moved on as input to the next subblock. Once all 16 subblocks are completed, the final register value is saved and the next 512-bit block begins. At the end of all these blocks, we get a final digest of the MD5 algorithm. Regarding the nonlinear process mentioned in the first step, the formula changes for each round it's being run on. This is done to maintain the computational complexity of the algorithm and to increase randomness of the procedure. The formula for each of the 4 rounds uses the same parameters, that is B, C, and D, to generate a single output. The formulas being used are shown on the screen right now. Algorithm. Unlike the latest hash algorithm families, a 32-bit digest is relatively easier to compare when verifying the digests. They don't consume a noticeable amount of disk storage and are comparatively easier to remember and reiterate. Passwords need not be stored in plain text format, making them accessible for hackers and malicious actors. When using digests, the database security also gets a boost since the size of all the hash values will be the same. In the event of a hack or a breach, the malicious actor will only receive the hashed values, so there is no way to regenerate the plain text, which would be the user passwords in this case. Since the functions are irreversible by design, hashing has become a compulsion when storing user credentials on the server nowadays. A relatively low memory footprint is necessary when it comes to integrating multiple services into the same framework without a CPU overhead. The digest size is the same and the same steps are run to get the hash value, irrespective of the size of the input string. This helps in creating a low requirement for computational power and is much easier to run on older hardware, which is pretty common in server farms around the world. We can monitor file corruption by comparing hash values before and after transit. Once the hashes match, file integrity checks are valid and we can avoid data corruption. Hash functions will always give the same output for the similar input, irrespective of the iteration parameters. It also helps in ensuring that the data hasn't been tampered with en route to the receiver of the message. We use our Wi-Fi every day for work, and we use the internet for entertainment and communication. The dependency on technology is at an all-time high, thanks to the radical developments and innovation in these last 2 decades. A big portion of this belongs to ensuring secure channels of communication and data transmission. The SHA Hash Algorithm are a family of cryptographic hash functions that are published by the National Institute of Standards and Technology along with the NSA. It was passed as a Federal Information Processing Standard, also known as FIPS. It has 4 different families of hash functions. SHA0 is a 160-bit hash function published in 1993, and it was closed down later after an undisclosed significant flaw. SHA1 is also a 160-bit hash function which resembles the earlier MD5 algorithm. This was designed by the NSA to be a part of the digital signature algorithm. SHA2 is a family of 2 similar hash functions with different block sizes, known as the SHA256 and the SHA512. They differ in the word size. SHA256 uses 32-bit words, while SHA512 uses 64-bit words. SHA3 is a hash function properly known as KCAC. It was chosen in 2012 after a public competition among non-NSA designers. It supports the same hash length as SHA2 and its internal structure differs significantly from the rest of the SHA family. As we have already iterated, the process is straightforward. We pass a plain text message to the SHA hash function, which in turn performs certain mathematical operations on the clear text to scramble the data. The 160-bit digest received from this is going to be radically different from the plain text. The goal of any hash function is to produce digests that appear to be random. To be considered cryptographically secure, the hash function should meet two requirements. First, that it is impossible for an attacker to generate a message that matches a specific hash value, and second, it should be impossible for an attacker to create two messages producing the exactly same hash value. Even a slight change in the plain text should trigger a drastic difference in the two digests. This goes a long way in preventing hash collisions, which takes place when two different plain texts have the same digest. The SHA family functions have some characteristics that they need to follow while generating their digests. Let's go through a few of them. The length of the clear text should be less than 2 to the power 64 bits in the case of SHA1 and SHA256. This is essential to keep the plain text compatible with the hash function, and the size needs to be in comparison area to keep the digest as random as possible. The length of the hash digest should be 256 bits in the SHA256 algorithm, 512 bits in the SHA512 algorithm, and so on. Bigger digest usually suggests significantly more calculations at the cost of speed and space. We typically go for the longest digest to bolster security, but there must be a definite balance between the speed and security of a hash function. By design, all hash functions of the SHA512, SHA256 are irreversible. You should neither get a plain text when you have the digest beforehand, nor should the digest provide the original value when you pass it through the same hash function again. Another case of protection is that when the hash digest is passed into the SHA function for a second time, we should get a completely different digest from the first instance. This is done to reduce the chance of brute force attacks. To achieve this level of intricacy, there are a number of steps to be followed before we receive the digest. Let us take a look at the detailed procedure as to how the SHA algorithm works. The first step is to make the plain text compatible with the hash function. To do this, we need to pad the bits in the message. When you receive the input string, you have to make sure the size is 64 bits short of a multiple of 512. When it comes to padding the bits, you must add 1 first, followed by the remaining zeros to round out the extra characters. This prepares our string to have a length just 64 bits less than any multiple of 512. Here on out, we can proceed to the next step where we have to pad the length bits. Initially, in the first step, we appended the message in such a way that the total number of bits in the message was 64 bits short from becoming a multiple of 512. Now we add the length of bits in such a way that the total number of bits in the message is a perfect multiple of 512. That means 64 bits plus the length of the original message becomes a multiple of 512. This becomes a final string that needs to be hashed. In the next step, we have to initialize these chaining variables. The entire plain text message can now be broken down into blocks of 512 bits each. Unlike other hash algorithms like MD5, which use 4 registers or buffers, SHA family use 5 buffers of 32 bits each. They are named A, B, C, D, and E. These registers go through multiple rounds of operation, where the first iteration has fixed hexadecimal values, as can be seen in the screen. Moving on, we have to process each of the 512-bit blocks by breaking each of them into 16 sub-blocks of 32 bits each. Each of them goes through 4 rounds of operation that use the entire register and have the 512-bit block along with the constant array. Out of those 4 rounds, each round has 20 iterations. So in general, we have 80 rounds sum total. The constant value of k is an array of 80 elements. Of those 80, 16 elements are being used each round, so that comes out to 80 rounds for each of those elements. The value of t differs by the number of rounds, as can be seen in the table below. A single formula is necessary to calculate the output of each round and iteration. The formula can be ABCDE register is equal to E plus a non-linear process P along with a circular shift of A plus WT plus KT. In this formula, ABCD is the register value of the chaining variables as we discussed before. P is the logical process which has a different formula for each round. S5 is a circular shift by 5 bits and WT is a 32-bit string derived from the existing subblock. This can be calculated depending on the iteration at hand. KT signifies a single element of the 80-character element array which changes depending on the particular round at hand. For the values of WT, the first 16 values are the same as that of the subblocks, so there is no extra calculation needed. For the next 64 elements, the value of WT can be calculated as shown in the formula here. To better understand this, let's take a look at how each of this goes in a sequential process. We have our initial register using the 5 words of 32 bits each. In the first step, we put the values of A, B, C and D to the subsequent register as the output. Next, we use a non-linear process P that changes depending on the round and uses the values of B, C and D as input. Whatever output is generated from the non-linear process, it is added with the value of the E register. Next, the value of A is circular shifted by 5 bits and is added with the output generated in the previous step. The next step is adding the value of WT and the constant element of KT. The current output is then stored in the register A. Similarly, this iteration is repeated every round and for each subblock in the process. Once all the registers are complete and all the subblocks are joined together to form the single ciphertext message, we will have our hashed output. Regarding the nonlinear process P that uses the values of B, C and D as input, the formula changes every round to maintain a complexity of the program that can withstand brute force attacks. Depending on the round, the values are passed through a logical operation which is then added with the values of WT, KT and so on. Now that we understand how to get our hash digest from the plain text, let us learn about the advantages we obtain when using the SHA hash algorithm instead of relying on data in a plain text format. Digital signatures follow asymmetric encryption methodology to verify the authenticity of a document or a file. Hash algorithms like SHA256 and the industry standard SHA 512 go a long way in ensuring the verification of signatures. Passwords need not be stored in a plain text format, which makes them accessible to hackers and other malicious actors. When using digest, the database security also gets a boost since the size of all hash values will be the same. In the event of a hack or a breach, the malicious actor will only receive the hash values with no way to regenerate the plain text. In this case, the plain text would be user credentials. Since the hash functions are irreversible by design, it has become a compulsion when storing passwords on the servers. The SSL handshake is a crucial segment of the web browsing sessions and it's done using SHA functions. It consists of your web browsers and the web servers agreeing on encryption keys and hashing authentication to prepare a secure connection. It relies on a combination of symmetric and asymmetric algorithms which ensure the confidentiality of the data transmitted between a web server and a web client like the browsers. You can monitor file corruption by comparing hash values before and after transit. Once the hashes match, file integrity checks are valid and data corruption is avoided. Hash functions will always give the same output for the same input, irrespective of the iteration parameters. It also helps in ensuring that the data hasn't been tampered with en route to the receiver of the message. Hope you learned something new today. If you have any questions from today's session, be sure to let us know in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Thank you for watching.